All right, welcome. Rebel Dharma, Wednesday night. My name is Jason Murphy. I teach here every Wednesday for quite a few years now. And yeah, is there anyone new to the group that would like to introduce themselves? All right. So we're going to do some meditation. Meditate. First time back in a while. Hi, Amanda. Welcome. Welcome back. Glad you found us again. So we're going to do some meditation. And then I'll continue the discussion around the life of the Buddha and perhaps focus on the precepts and having some discussions about the kind of training rules or training practices. So we'll get a little bit more into that as the night moves on. All right, so finding a posture that's workable, that's sustainable, where you feel relaxed and alert. Oh. Good, and as we settle in, opening to the comings and goings of sound. Good, and perhaps taking a few moments and just really arriving here in this body, this sitting, breathing body. The invitation is to stay. No matter how many times the attention wanders off, to just return to this present time experience of breath and body. As non-judgmentally and forgiving as possible, knowing that the attention wanders. The mind can be scattered and busy and restless and agitated. It also can be sleepy and drowsy, numb, agitated. So just kind of checking in and what's the mental state, perhaps. Of course, it's helpful to allow some attention to the breath. Particularly the tip of the nose or the rise and fall of the belly. Just aiming the attention in a particular way. And then trying to sustain that attention for as long as possible. And then just returning again and again. Breathing in. Know that you're breathing in. Breathing out. Know that you're breathing out. aim, connect, and sustain each moment, each breath, again and again, without judgment or criticism. Thoughts, feelings, sensations arising, staying for a time, passing away. Relaxing into each new breath, observing what arises, and allowing whatever arises to stay for a time and pass away. When or if the mind gets kind of carried away to some future or past, just acknowledging where it's gone, and with that sense of friendliness or kindness with the mind, aiming the attention back, relaxing into the next breath, body, here. Observing what arises and allowing what arises to pass away. Again, and again. breath, body, sound arising, passing away. All right. Where do we go from here? Any thoughts or questions about the practice, about Buddhism in general? Frank, welcome back.
Thank you. So just in terms of like somebody who's been meditating forever,
Mhm.
you know how we break it down into breath and then into maybe sound or the environment,
Mhm.
and then more on the mind.
Mhm.
As somebody who's an experienced meditator,
Mhm.
how strictly do you do that in your practice?
So the question, I was asked to try to repeat the question because we don't have a mic in the room. And for those of you at home, you might not hear it. So I'll paraphrase or do the best I can. We use this kind of 4 foundations of mindfulness as a frame. This was given by the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutta. Satipatthana means 4 foundations of mindfulness. And so that there's a bit of it feels like a linear trajectory in the teaching but in the experience, it might not feel very linear, right? So my understanding of the question is, how do I practice with that, right? Do I is it linear in my practice, or is it more kind of all encompassing, or is that kind of what you're saying?
Structure it.
Right. I mean, I feel like as an application for teaching, it's good to focus on breath and body initially, mainly just because we are so kind of overemphasized with our minds and our ability to think and plan, and we're just very as a species, I think we have these big brains, and they're busy and they're activated, and we've been prefacing them as that's considered in Buddhism the sixth sense is the mind, but we preface the sixth sense and really we preface it as who we are so often. So as the first stage of kind of disentangling our misidentification with the self being our brains or our minds, the emphasis, I believe, in the Satipatthana teaching, 4 foundations of mindfulness teaching, is to de-emphasize the thinking mind and really focus in on other things that are present. So breath and body are good, they're grounding. There's also a level of the impermanent nature of breath, the impermanent nature of the sensations of this body, the impermanent nature of the rising and falling of sound, or the coming and going of sound. So that tends to be the foundational kind of practice in, Western Vipassana anyway, which is kind of what I teach. And Vipassana really means insight. So the word Vipassana means insight. And so I feel like I will, when I'm going through instruction and teaching people how to meditate, let's stay focused on the breath and body. Let's move into the second foundation, which is known as kind of feeling tone. The third foundation, which is kind of perception. And then the fourth foundation, the perception is a different list. So the first foundation being kind of breath and body, second foundation being feeling tone, which is connected to perception. As we begin to tune into the feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral based on our sensory experience, then we start to recognize that we have certain perceptions. And then in the third foundation is kind of like, once we've grounded in the body and done that practice, then we can begin to kind of turn the attention toward the mind and the contents of the mind. Really, what I think, and we've talked about this before, like with the trains of thought and whatnot, what we're really looking at is the patterns of the mind. Because once we can calm it down a bit, we actually begin to see that there's certain themes, there's certain patterns that are repeating on a loop based on perception. And then the fourth foundation of mindfulness is really the kind of unpacking of the teachings and applying the teachings to what we're experiencing. So that's the trajectory. Now, in practice, in what's commonly called Vipassana or insight, that can happen very naturally in just what we did tonight. I gave some very simple instructions, and I give these simple, I haven't really found better instructions. So that's kind of why, there's all of these different instructions, and I switch it up sometimes. But for Vipassana, insight meditation, aim, connect, sustain for a few times, collecting the attention. Could take 20 minutes, could take 5 minutes, could take, 15 minutes. could take 5 years. This collecting of attention. And then once we have kind of established mindfulness using that breath, body, sound as the anchors, then it's kind of like really maybe more like an opening. And we've also had these conversations before, an opening to the next kind of wave of experience, which might be that felt sense of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then there might be the next wave of experience, which I often use, relax, observe, allow, is really third foundation, fourth foundation. And so, yeah, I feel like it's experiential. It's not necessarily linear, but it can be linear, and it can be boom. We're just sitting in the awareness, relaxing into each new breath, observing what's arising, thoughts, sounds, feelings, ideas. We're observing it. We're not engaged in it. We're not entangled by it. Now that takes some work to do that. And you just got off a retreat, so you probably recognized, right? Mm-hmm. The work that it takes to really settle in, and then perhaps drop down lower than, or higher than you would just coming here once or twice a week, right? So I love your question. And I think both things are true. And that we often need to really, and especially in this kind of freewheeling, living our lives every day, not on retreat, not really dedicating, most of our waking hours to meditation or mindfulness, which is the kind of tendency of, these kind of groups. Yeah, that we are kind of constantly establishing and re-establishing that first foundation of mindfulness, of breath and body. So that's kind of the way that I view it. And for me, if I recognize kind of what I did tonight, like I recognized and I asked you to recognize what's going on, what's happening in the mind. Is there agitation? Is there restlessness? Is there sleepiness? And then let's use a little of that containment, that aim, connect, sustain, to establish a little bit of concentration, and then opening. And I feel like sometimes opening too soon can just lead to real spaciness. It can feel relaxing, but it's not actually helping us to collect and to attune to what's actually going on in our experience, right? So did that answer your question?
Yeah. So for you, I'm kind of thinking of it like going to the gym and
Mm-hmm.
warming up.
Mm-hmm.
You don't jump right into the big strength things, like third or fourth
foundation.
So is that something kind of it you approach it like you come in and kind of get the aim, sustain, contain going at first, and then you kind of know from your experience that you're ready to open it up?
Yeah, if I start to feel settled, there's like a visceral, and quite literally, this is a good segue into some of the psychological and trauma-focused work I've been doing. And one of the ways of talking about the benefits of meditation, but there is a theory called polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory is basically talking about reactivity, and when we get activated in our sympathetic nervous system. And then, so there's ventral vagal, which is the lowest part of on our spine, by our kidneys. There's this nerve that runs up that feeds all of our other nerves. Part of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And I'm not going to get too into this because I want to stay focused on the question. But the ventral vagal, which is this sense of feeling connected, feeling joy, feeling safe, This is it's low. It's like belly button, right? And a little bit lower. And so when I'm starting to meditate, I might really try to ground into that lower kind of the ventral vagal system. Now, just to finish the polyvagal theory, the middle system, which is usually around kind of the chest area from the belly button up to about the throat, is the sympathetic activation. So when we're kind of angry, when we're frightened, when we're frustrated, we're activated here. And everyone knows this. Everyone knows this. We all do it. And it happens reactively. And the more traumatized or the more reactive someone has become and unaware of it, also, they might actually start having some real issues here, right? Stomach issues or, indigestion and IBS. There's all kinds of chronic fatigue. There's all kinds of stuff that can happen. But that basically is like we're in fight or flight. And then dorsal vagal is this kind of kind of shoulders, about the heart level up. And this a lot of times can feel very sluggish or shut down or numb. And so by aligning with a meditative capacity, one wants to kind of feel that grounding before kind of opening to the other aspects of what's happening, and then also just kind of continually checking in. Okay, in my center line, in my core, am I relaxed? That's why I'm also utilizing this relax, observe, allow, because usually when we're off, when the mind will wander off, as you know. And sometimes it wanders off to some really interesting places. And it can be very fucking enticing, right? It's like, oh, that's kind of a sexy thought. Like, I really want to go there. I really want to just kind of fully go into that fantasy and not even recognize that it's happening. And then at some point, you'll recognize it's happening. And in that moment, relax. Can we soften? Notice if there's any kind of tension happening in the body. Try to bring that awareness back down. Yes. So this kind of opening for me, it's that I'm always kind of trying to I don't just jump into observing the mind, because I don't feel like it's very skillful. I don't feel like it's possible, actually. I feel like maybe there's other people who are way more advanced than me, which there are plenty. And I feel like maybe they could just kind of drop in to observing the mind, but it's not my practice. I will sometimes pretty quickly, I can open to what's called, full vipassana, right? Which is all four foundations, just kind of being with what is, but I tend to not do that unless I'm feeling grounded and connected and kind of activating that ventral vagal kind of area. If you're interested in the polyvagal theory, just Google it, polyvagal theory. And the kind of author or leader of the kind of research is Steve Porges, and Stephen Porges, Dr. Stephen Porges. And so much of the work of meditation and the work of kind of building resources around trauma and addiction, recovery, mental health, mental well-being is so connected to this polyvagal. It's not necessarily like a therapeutic practice. It's more like a result of what we're doing here. And also a result of what we don't do, right? So if we're not learning to meditate, learning to ground, learning to calm, learning to recognize when we're triggered or stimulated, aroused in some way, it generally can happen mentally, but it also can happen just physically. then we're just going to be off the rails, so. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, recently I got this fitness tracker. And
Mhm.
it actually tracks like quote unquote stress in my body.
Yeah.
So I think it tracks it through my skin temperature and my heart rate. And sometimes I've had meditation sessions where I go into it and I feel good.
Mhm.
I feel pretty zen. And those are kind of like the states that you mentioned where my mind's very clear. There's very little going on. But those are like a small subset of my meditation sessions. Most of the time, especially when I'm not that consistent, like right now, when I meditate, my mind is still like pretty kind of crazy. It's like still hectic and it's busy, right? And when I have those sessions, I actually notice that my fitness tracker actually says that I'm a little stressed.
When you're having the more mental
Yeah.
kind of activity,
During the meditation.
Like agitation and what, because they're probably connected. Yeah, you're probably your heart rate or your nervous system.
Which is kind of interesting to me because I feel like in my mind when you meditate, it should go down, right? Or you should feel, I don't know, maybe like the goal is sort of like to make that go down or like to be more relaxed. Has that ever been, does that mean I'm doing something wrong, or does that mean, have you had a similar sort of experience?
Let me just kind of paraphrase the question. He has like a Fitbit or like some kind of a tracker, and he's talking about how when sometimes he'll meditate and he'll have like a lowering of heart rate, a lower, like a sense of calm that can be tracked, right? And then sometimes he'll also have meditation experiences where there's a lot of mental kind of agitation and restlessness, and his Fitbit or whatever it is it a Fitbit?
It's
Similar, right?
Yes.
It's a tracker, a wearable, will tell him that he's maybe stressed or agitated. And and then the kind of this ridiculous question of, am I doing something wrong? So obviously you are not doing anything wrong, right? And it's interesting, I think, the sensitivity that wearable has on seeing, and I wouldn't know what it is. Maybe it's temperature, maybe it's fluctuation of heart rate, maybe it's circulation. I don't know what it's tracking, but it's a great example of how mental phenomena affects us physiologically. That just, you're not doing anything other than recognizing that there is restlessness or agitation, or it's harder to kind of settle in the mind, and your, Fitbit is tracking that. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great awareness that, and then also to see when there's those times where maybe you are able to, well, there's another kind of sub question that you asked, which was about kind of being calm. Like, is that the kind of the goal? And it's actually not. No, the goal is to figure out what the fuck is going on here. You know what I mean? Like, and sometimes that means that there's mental agitation in the mind. And there's disturbing images, and then there's patterns that we haven't maybe seen. And so sometimes it's about actually turning, this is the third foundation of mindfulness, actually turning our attention toward the mental fabrications that are, and then maybe even seeing even one step further of that these mental fabrications, how are these mental fabrications being created? How are these patterns repeating? And how can we let them go? Or what is it that, there's a whole nother kind of a psychological, spiritual, new agey kind of way of thinking about what are these patterns trying to tell you? What is unattended? I say this a lot. what is unattended, that the mental agitation is continually bringing up. So in other words, what's in the way of the peace and ease that would be our natural state, could be our natural state. But sometimes we're there, sometimes we're not, you know. But it's interesting to kind of see the tracker. I have like an Apple Watch. I don't wear it very often, just when I like need it for something. Yeah, I think it's interesting that kind of thing. And also I think related to the polyvagal kind of theory and like what's happening, how are we becoming agitated? Which leads me into the topic for tonight, which, you know, the topic is really about the precepts. But before I get into the precepts, I'm just going to, talk a little bit about this kind of first. Well, actually, should I do that? Yeah, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to talk. I've been reading out of this book, the Buddha and His Teachings. And I want to read a bit about some reflections from the author around the Dhamma. It's called the Dhammacakka Sutta. Dhammacakka Sutta is the first teaching of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha gave. And so this is just some insights and some kind of truisms, you could say, found in Buddhism. So this is the author basically like summarizing the Four Noble Truths and, kind of the Theravadan view of Buddhism. Buddhism is based on personal experience. As such, it is rational and not speculative. The Buddha discarded all authority and evolved a golden mean, which was purely his own. In other words, this kind of understanding or this is what's known. Buddhism is a way or a path. So it's not a doctrine, it's considered a path that one follows, right? Rational understanding is the keynote of Buddhism, rational understanding. So blind beliefs are dethroned. We've talked quite a bit about this. And instead of beliefs and dogmas, the importance of practice is emphasized. Mere beliefs and or dogmas cannot emancipate a person. Rites and ceremonies so greatly emphasized in the Vedas, which are the kind of Hindu teachings that came before Buddhism, that so rites and ceremonies so greatly emphasized in the Vedas play no part in Buddhism. Within Buddhism, there are no gods and no like kind of proselytization that takes place. There is no kind of priestly class to mediate. And this was one of the ways in which, the Buddha really was kind of like, yeah, we're lost. We're confused about this, like the upper, just like this ruling class of Brahmins that somehow had the authority, kind of like what you would find in the Catholic Church or even in Tibetan Buddhism or something like that, hierarchical kind of standards. So I just feel like I wanted to talk a little bit about that because it's bringing some of what we've been talking about into play, and then touch a bit on the precepts, or at least the premise, the four foundations. The Four Noble Truths, the basic kind of premise of Buddhism. And then, but I want to talk specifically about the precepts today. So, the Buddhist path consisted not only of mindfulness, concentration, and what we call the insight practices, but also virtue, morality, sometimes it's called. The word that is used in Pali is sila, and sila really begins with the 5 precepts. And, you know, over the years, there's been, especially here in the West, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about the precepts, that the precepts are not commandments. They're not have-tos. They are choices. They are suggested as training principles. And sometimes there's this kind of, I guess, misguided or misunderstanding that that it's like Sunday school kind of rules, you know, that we're bound to. So from the Buddhist perspective, the precepts are a course of therapy for the mind and for the wounded mind, for the wounds of the mind, right? And that, you know, there's kind of 2 ailments that we want to kind of focus on here. One is low self-esteem, and the other is regret and denial. And so the precepts and this practice are really helping us to increase self-esteem and in sense kind of purify the mind. So there's a few ways that the morality group, or, well, before I kind of get into the idea of morality, the word sila often and it gets translated to mean morality, right? But from the Buddhist perspective, it actually means harmony. So that sila, or the precepts, really are about harmony, creating harmony within our own hearts and minds, and then within the world. And that's the goal. And so there's 5 that the Buddha, so the Buddha had, you know, this was an evolving thing. So if you think about, okay, he gave his first teaching, right, to the 5 ascetics that he had been practicing with before he left to go on his own and practice, and started to, you know, eat a little more. And he just recognized that this rigid view wasn't actually working for him. And he, in his, you know, wisdom, was like, yeah, this rigid view isn't working, and I need to go find something that does work. And so he did. And then he came back to his friends that were close to awakening. They were close to enlightenment. And, you know, and then he gave this teaching around the 4 noble truths, right? That there is suffering in this world, and that we're constantly bound by this suffering, this tanha, this craving, this unquenchable thirst for pleasure, or the pushing away of that which is unpleasant. So there's this grasping, this attachment to wanting things to be other than they are, and that keeps us bound to suffering. And then the 3rd noble truth is, you know, basically that, you know, he basically was saying, I discovered a way out. I discovered how to put down what he calls the kilesas, you know, the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. And that is basically the 3rd truth. And then the 4th truth is that there is a path, a prescription leading to this end of suffering, and I will share with you the path. Bare minimum, 5 precepts. Now, why are there 5 precepts? There's actually, he started with, these are the basic kind of requirements, you know. And if you want to stop suffering, if you want to eliminate suffering in your life, you need to stop doing these things. Killing, abstaining from, so there's a few different pieces here. So one is abstaining from kind of falsehood or slander, harsh speech, useless words. Stop causing suffering with your interactions, your interpersonal connections, mainly using how you communicate. Which I often translate to don't be a jackass, right? Right action, and this under right, so that was right speech. Under right action is abstinence from killing, to abstain from killing living beings. And it didn't really differentiate. He just kind of said all living beings, like humans, yes, animals, yes, bugs, worms, yes. To abstain from killing all living beings. And then to abstain from stealing or taking that which is not offered. And then to abstain from sexual misconduct. And there's, some understanding about what that means, and there's some translations about what that means. But basically, he meant to be wise and careful with sexuality, and to treat it in the same way, to abstain from causing harm with sexuality or with sexual even intention. And then the fifth being to abstain from mind-altering substances, or substances that cloud the mind and lead to heedlessness, is one of the ways it's often described. I think it's important to recognize that these first five, like I said, they're ways to begin to set the groundwork to heal the wounds of the mind. And how do we do that? By not continuing to act out the traumas or the reactivity or the unskillful, maladaptive behaviors that perhaps we learned or were intergenerationally passed down. There's lots of different ways in which you can talk about that from a psychological perspective. But basically, what I think is the Buddha is saying, learn to contain your own suffering, and then commit to not spilling that suffering out onto the rest of the world. And by doing that, we can feel safe, and we can help others to feel safe in the world. And this includes animals. I was so fascinated at these retreat centers that I would go to, one particularly Spirit Rock. Spirit Rock has been a designated Buddhist meditation center where these 5 precepts have been really imprinted into the earth there for years, 30 years. And so there's 30 years, we can call them generations, of animals that have lived on that land. And they will come right up to you. Deer and wild turkeys. Wild turkeys take over the place for like a whole month. It's very fascinating. Lizards, birds, that there is almost like some kind of and I've seen this at other monasteries too, where there's some kind of a protective field that the animals can sense, and that they just kind of know they're safe. Of course, there can be a cougar or a mountain lion or something that comes in and does what they do, right? And, hawks will still get a lizard, and that's just the nature of things, It's not like we're stopping it, but the intentional non-harming is really palatable when I've been at different places where that is part of this ethos, So I think just for all of us to begin to kind of identify with where, just in these 5 precepts, we cause suffering for ourselves, or we have caused suffering for others. And then it's not about admonishing ourselves for doing that. It's more like recognizing, oh, this is an area that I need more attention, false speech or gossip, or maybe I like, okay, I'll like telling myself, when I was a kid, I used to love to burn ants. Like I used to get like a can of Lysol and a lighter and just fucking light them up, like blow torching colonies. It was just something I did as a kid. And it was like I don't know, like a weird torture thing. I had power. I got some gratification from it. I don't know. I mean, I was like 8 years old, 8 years old with a lighter and can of hairspray, 80s, I mean, 70s actually. But, that was like a thing, and that it was just something that I did. Why did I do that? No, I mean, there's many probably psychological reasons why that was. But at some point, after maybe about 5 years of practice, I just really, I'm not going to say I haven't killed any insects since then, because I haven't. I mean, I have. Matter of fact, I just killed a cockroach in my house not that long ago. Because, where there's one, there's many. But the recognition of intentionally causing harm, and the commitment that I have made to not intentionally cause harm as like whenever possible. And I think it's important to recognize that, because there's the ideal of that reality of not causing harm, not taking life, and then there's the kind of application of that. How does that really play out? And I've explored it in lots of different ways. I've not killed insects. I've been very intentional around my kind of food intake. I've been not very intentional about my food intake, that kind of thing. Like there's lots of different ways in which we can all find to work with that. And the key here is not perfection, but knowing how that plays out. Like, yes, I killed a cockroach a couple of weeks ago. And I actually really recognized that I killed this living being that probably wasn't out to harm me, and it actually, I had some remorse about it. And I also knew that I needed to not have a house full of cockroaches. So it was a thing. Anyway. So that's one aspect of kind of looking at, abstaining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and abstinence from mind-altering substances. So that's the basic 5. And the Buddha basically was saying, look, if you want to free your heart and mind, follow these 5 basic precepts to the best of your ability, and be aware and gain a sensitivity when you step outside of the ideal, which is basically what I was just talking about around the cockroach situation. Recognize that there's something else at play that's being affected. And that goes, so this kind of idea of gaining in sensitivity. And as we begin to progress in our practice, we will begin to recognize how this benefits us, how this can help us to heal our minds. Now, that's considered the first stage of renunciation, the 5 precepts. They could be worked on for a lifetime. So I've been on longer meditation retreats where you have an option to take 8 precepts. And so 8 precepts are based, so there's and so there's 5, and then there's 8, and then there's 10, and then there's like 227. So it's kind of like a stage thing. So the 5 is kind of what was suggested for all of us to work on. Taking 8 precepts, basically it's the first 5, plus it's no entertainment. So no reading for pleasure, no listening to music, no kind of playing music, no zoning out on YouTube. This is kind of the like not distracting the mind, right? To give a little bit more focus on practice. The other one is to not sleep in a high or luxurious bed. In other words, to not be kind of decadent. That's just one of the precepts. And when I was living in a few different monasteries, I slept on a hardwood floor with either just like a little pad, like a little sleeping pad. And sometimes I didn't even have a sleeping pad. They just would give you like a wicker kind of roll up, like a window shade thing, and just like have like a little, and my whatever my sheet or my blanket was. Not comfortable. Yeah, I learned how to sleep on my back, and I'm a side sleeper. One time I was at this monastery, and I was not happy about it, but I got used to it. They gave me a cell that was literally concrete, it was literally like a jail cell. Bars on the windows. It had a concrete slab, no mattress at all, and a wooden pillow that was literally like a block of wood with kind of a neck cut out, right? And that was what I had. The good thing was that place had a hot springs, so I got to relieve a lot of aches and pains. But you know what I mean? So the idea now, and I think that's pretty extreme, right? In the not high and luxurious bed, to what you might have encountered, maybe you encountered on the retreat, where not the ideal bed, not not a memory foam, not a whatever, sleep number bed or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's another level of renunciation, right? So we're learning to renounce kind of comfort, which is a useful skill. The other, let's see, that was probably 7. The 8th precept, and I'm not getting these right in order, but as I'm remembering them. The 8th precept that one would take when going on a retreat, which is considered a monastic retreat, is to not eat after noon, right? So that there's maybe that there's 2 meals a day. There's a breakfast and there's a lunch, and then basically skipping dinner, right? And some people choose to do that. I often choose to do that when I'm on longer retreats, and mainly because I feel like there's more. I feel lighter. I feel like there's more clarity that can come, and I can actually have more energy. I'm not as lethargic into the evening, and that's true for some people, and not true. And some people can't do that. Some people won't stay at a monastery or do a monastic retreat because they really, we have a lot of stuff around food. We have a lot of stuff around food, right? Around the comfort of food, around the, what are we doing? How are we consuming it? For what purpose? And sometimes people have, allergies and different kind of things that have, so that maybe prevents them from doing something like taking an 8th precept. Most of the time, it's optional for lay people. For monks and nuns, it's not optional. So that's 8. So the 9th precept is around not engaging with money. So when I became what's called a pakao, which is it's the first level of ordination in northeastern Thailand, I took on 10 precepts, and So it was all the 8 that I said. Oh yeah, and then no beautification of the body. That was the 10th precept. So no using of money, no beautification of the body. And actually in Thailand, you shave your eyebrows as a way, like a further kind of being like, we're all kind of the same. Like and it has something to do with ego. I think it also has something to do with, has something to do with, yeah, the beautification and the kind of like we're all kind of the same, which is why people are often, all monks wear the same robe, they wear the same color. They do identify with one sect to a different sect, you'll see different colors, but basically it's about kind of being kind of connected as a kind of a whole and not an individual, right? It was a big deal for me to shave my eyebrows, actually. I remember it like really like, because it was also a stage of I'm committing to be here. Because before it was like, yeah, you're just taking 5 precepts and actually it ended up being, it was probably 6 precepts. I probably wasn't supposed to read for entertainment, but I did during my first couple of weeks at the monastery. And then I was like, all right, now you're going to be here. You're going to take this level of ordination. You're going to take this next level of renunciation. And shaving my eyebrows was like, I don't know. Like, how long will it take for it to grow back? Like, I really wanted to know. Yeah. I was contemplating ordaining at the time. But anyway, that was a kind of a big deal. But that's 10, right? So that's the 10, the 10 precepts of further renunciation. And then the next kind of step is like, and it depends, but mostly the next step for full ordination is 227 precepts. And these evolved over time, that the Buddha in his first kind of, years of teaching really gave everyone the 5 precepts, with the first precept of do no harm, right? Ahimsa, meaning do no harm. And then the precepts evolved more and more as they began, once someone's fully ordained, as training rules. And there's all kinds of weird ones. And, stuff like, one of them, like that's very common in Thailand is, and in most of Theravada and Buddhism, is that monks are forbidden to touch the opposite sex. And which of course is heteronormative and limiting in scope, because there's plenty of gay or trans or, non-binary folks that are actually living in Thailand. And many of them have been monks or nuns, So but at the time that became a rule at one point. And why did it become a training precept or a training rule? Because there was some impropriety, maybe some sexual misconduct that took place, some crossing of the boundary that a monk and a lay person, which actually there's lots of stories about that, where monks will disrobe because they, there's this beautiful, young maiden that comes and brings offerings to the monastery and is devout, and the monk falls in love, and then he disrobes and they go off and get married. That's happened countless times. And sometimes it's not welcomed and it's inappropriate. And so, okay, there's a rule here. If you're ordained as a monastic, not having contact. I want to talk about this for a second, because I spent some time in a monastery called Abhayagiri, and Abhayagiri means fearless mountain, and it's in Northern California. And it's where one of my main teachers, Ajahn Pasano, or Longpor Pasano, lives when he's not in Thailand. And I used to bring groups of teenagers to go on these pilgrimages to Abhayagiri. And and there was, there's all these monks that are there, right? I mean, it's a monastery. So there's a lot of monks that live there, and they live off in the forest, and they're super cool. They're awesome people. And we would bring this group of, boys and girls, and camp, and then they would do various things. Anyway, so there's this rule that monks aren't supposed to touch the opposite sex and vice versa. And, teenagers don't really know the rules necessarily, even though we're making them. But, something happened where there was a monk who was, off kind of supporting a group of teens kind of practicing in the forest. And a girl that was there, like a teenage girl, fell and like twisted her ankle really bad. And they were like 5 miles away from the main monastery, up in this big mountain called the Bayagiri. And so the monk had no other option but to pick this girl up and carry her. I don't know why I'm getting emotional about it. Interesting. But choosing to break the precept because it's the right thing to do, and risked being disrobed, kicked out of the monastery for breaking that rule. Of course, that's not what happened. It was appropriate and it was unnecessary. It's one of the things that we talk about in Buddhism, known as skillful means, which is that like, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's what was the intention, right? And so, yeah, I just found that to be a really interesting kind of, and just such, and it wasn't like, and he was super shy. He didn't want any praise, but he did what needed to do. He wasn't so rigid that he was like, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to figure out your own way with your broken ankle to get down this mountain. I don't know. I found that to be very heartfelt. Yeah. So what's called skillful means. So anyway, so the 227 precepts, and the female monastics, the bhikkhunis, have 331 precepts, self-imposed. It's not like the monks said, okay, well, you female, monks, nuns need to have more because you're unruly. The bhikkhuni, so there's bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The bhikkhuni order, the order of nuns, self-imposed extra precepts. And I don't actually know what they are. I don't remember what they are. I don't remember which ones are different. But anyway, I feel like this is, kind of, it's useful. It's important to kind of talk about how these precepts are, they have, different focuses, right? There's a psychological, this kind of harmony to the mind, protection from inner splitting or guilt or regret or remorse. On a karmic level, the observance of sila ensures harmony with the kind of the cosmic law of karma, which is, basically what we're trying to do here is quote unquote cleanse or purify our karma, which is what I talked about earlier as the wounds of the mind, the things that are unattended, or that we are still having there's been some ways in which we have caused harm in the past, and that has a karmic momentum or repercussion internally or externally. And that's considered, kind of the cosmic law of karma. So hence kind of favorable results in the course of future movement through the round of repeated birth and death. So karma and this cleansing of karma and this birth and rebirth is part of the cosmology and psychology within Buddhism. And, you know, even though there's some practicality and there's some, you know, this is what is happening here. There is also this understanding of deeper or more expansive laws of the universe that we don't fully comprehend with our quote unquote small minds, you know. So I'm going to end there because we're just about at time. Is there any kind of thoughts or questions about what I've talked about so far tonight? Well, maybe we'll touch on this again. I mean, we'll absolutely touch on it again because it's important. But I think I'm going to move into karma and rebirth as seems to be the trajectory. All right. So thank you for your time and attention. And we just pay some homage or some merit, gathering all the goodness of our practice. May we all find the necessary practice and awakening, freedom from suffering. May all beings be free from suffering, and may any goodness that's come from this practice be dedicated to that happening.